How's it going, everyone? This is Gabi, and today I'm doing a quick Killzone 2 commentary, and I'm going to talk about the controls in Killzone 2 versus Killzone 3. Now, Killzone 2, for those who haven't played, is a fantastic game, as is Killzone 3, but both Killzone 2 and Killzone 3 adopted a very different approach to how the game's controlled. Now, at first, the button layout is identical, so there is no huge learning curve there because it's the same, and if you want, you can even make the game control like nearly every other shooter out there by selecting the different options. I would have liked to see an ability to remap buttons on console games, including this game, of course, but yet again, that's not a standard feature, so I can't really complain that it doesn't exist, especially as there's enough options in terms of horizontal and vertical sensitivities, etc. And both Killzone games are definitely games where you really want to actually fine-tune your sensitivities to actually be able to play this game and compete. Otherwise, you will struggle. Now, most games I find the default sensitivity generally does the job for me. Yes, tweaking it does help, but it's not a massive difference for me, where I really have to stress at Killzone 2 and 3, you really have to change your sensitivities around, otherwise you really might find yourself struggling against some better players. Now, I'm personally not the best player in the world, and I come across some players who absolutely blow me away, but nonetheless, I feel that that's advice that should be applied to any game essentially, but Killzone 2 and 3 I find that to be particularly pertinent. Now, why I'm wanting to talk about the Killzone 2 controls versus Killzone 3 controls is essentially because of how different they feel. Now, Killzone 2 definitely went down this weighty feel, as did Killzone 3, but they went down this path in a very different way. Now, what I mean by a weighty feel is they wanted you to feel as if you were a soldier carrying a whole lot of equipment on you, and thus you weren't able to do everything you wanted to immediately. It would actually take you a moment to actually aim properly, etc. Now, in Killzone 2, they initially tried to provide this weighty feel by actually introducing a latency to the controls. Now, most games go with the minimal amount of latency as you can, because that means you can instantly aim where you want to aim, or not necessarily instantly, but as quickly as is possible. Now, Killzone 2 did away with this idea to create this weighty feel, and it was certainly effective. However, it was not to everyone's tastes, and a lot of people complained about it, and as a result they released a high precision mode which reduced the latency. It was still present and there was still a weighty feel to it, but it greatly reduced the amount. Now, this gave the game a less weighty feel, and it also, in my eyes, imbalanced the multiplayer because you were able to more quickly aim. Now, a lot of people who were fans already of Killzone 2 when they released this patch were very disappointed because it did definitely imbalance the game, because if you weren't playing in high precision mode, you were at a significant disadvantage. And the thing that most people were disappointed about was the game that they loved had been significantly or notably changed. And this wouldn't have been such an issue if they just applied it to single player, but of course it was applied to both single player and multiplayer. And whilst you did have a choice to play with it or without, it was something that was really unwanted by the actual majority of players, or from what I saw on Killzone forums, etc. It seemed to be a very unwanted patch that some people, yes, did enjoy, but for the most part, the people who didn't like the weighty controls to begin with, this patch didn't really solve anything for them. They still didn't like the weighty feel that was still present, because it didn't totally remove that weighty feel. Now, from what I understand, Killzone 3 went down a very different path to create this weighty feel. Instead of using input lag, they reduced that as much as humanly possible for a game running at 30 FPS, which both Killzone 2 and 3 run at 30 FPS on console, and of course are only available on PS3. Now, there are some frame rate drops or drops below that in both Killzone 2 and 3, especially in multiplayer when a particular chaotic scene is occurring, such as several explosions are going off and there's 10 people on screen, etc., which is unfortunate, but then again, it wasn't game-breaking, and it never really ruined my enjoyment of the game because it wasn't an overly significant issue. So, you know now that the Killzone 3 didn't use input lag to create that weighty feel, so how did they do it? Well, apparently their aim, at least, was to do it via animation. So the actual animations of how you run, of how you aimed, etc., was meant to create the sensation of weight. Nonetheless, despite this aim and this aim to not actually use input lag, a lot of people upon Killzone 3's release still complained about there being input lag. Now, given that there isn't meant to be any, I was actually wondering why that was. And I came across one possibility. I'm not sure if this is correct, it's just a thought, but in Killzone 2 and Killzone 3, when you're playing, to actually undertaken an action such as running then firing, there's actually a brief pause where in most games you can almost immediately fire if you're running. You stop very quickly and then you fire, whereas in Killzone 2 and Killzone 3 there's this brief pause whereby your character stops running, and it's a lot larger than it is in most games, and thus it's much harder to control, and you actually have to be a lot more careful with how you move around the map, because if you aren't, you'll run around the corner and there'll be someone there walking who can almost immediately shoot in comparison to when you're running, and it makes it very hard to actually compete if you're not careful with how you actually move around the map. That is just the thought though. This is something that's present in nearly all actions in Killzone 2 and 3, so if for example you're picking up ammo, there's a brief pause after you pick up ammo whereby you can't really aim or shoot essentially. Now, one of the reasons I'm thinking this could be the actual reason why some people don't like the controls in Killzone 2 and 3 is the fact that most people who didn't like the controls in Killzone 2 initially still didn't like the controls in the high precision mode. Likewise, the people who didn't like the controls in Killzone 2 often didn't like the controls in Killzone 3. Now this is of course a generalization. There are people who like the controls in Killzone 2 and didn't like them in Killzone 3 and vice versa. Now once again, I really want to stress that this isn't definitive in any way, of course. It's just a correlation I've noticed amongst people I play with, that a lot of people who didn't like the Killzone 2 controls still don't like the controls in Killzone 3, and vice versa, and not many people who didn't like the controls in Killzone 2 like the controls in Killzone 3. Now this could be just a stigma that they've attached to the series, or it could be that it's not the actual input lag that's causing this distaste of how the game controls. I'm not entirely sure, but it'll be interesting to hear your thoughts on this. Anyway, this is Gabi. I do hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, consider giving it a like and subscribe, as it does help us out, and I do hope to see you next time.